Okay, this is Dr. Greg Smith back, and this is the week 3 mini lecture. We're going to finish up a few items on background material, and then we're going to dive right into the discussion on Genesis chapters 1 through 11 and get a little head start on that. There's just so much there, and there's so much to say, or at least I want to say, because there's a lot of controversy about those chapters, and there's a lot of strong opinions about that you'll run into in the church or in your youth group or whatever, whether it relates to Genesis 1 and the debate between science and religion, or you get into the flood narratives and you talk about how much water or how little water and things like that mean. People are asking these questions. So let's go ahead and talk about the world of the Old Testament. And this is one of my favorite maps. You'll see it a lot in my lectures that basically I try to show where things all got started. The historical time frame of the Old Testament, you go back 3000 BC to about 400 BC, and as we saw last time, 400 BC is that magic time when everything starts to close down with regards to the formation of the canon. But we have written records that go all the way back to the Sumerian context, 3100 BC. We have evidence of development of urban centers that really go all the way back to 7000 BC. For example, ancient Jericho has archaeological layers that go back pretty far. But the biblical history begins in the Mesopotamian Tigris-Euphrates River Valley area. And we're going to see when we get into our text of Genesis 1 through 11 that we would put the beginning of human history there as well, with regards to the image of God-bearing humanity, that is. And based on the genealogies, we can get a fair approximation, genealogies of Genesis 5 and 10 and 11, from Abraham all the way back to Adam. Adam, creation day 6, would go back to some 6,000 to 10,000 years ago in this area. We have the rise of the Sumerian culture, climaxing at its zenith with ancient the Ur 3 period back to 2100 to 1900 BC. This was like a climactic time in that Mesopotamian area. And guess who shows up in Ur? You can see it on your map just above the globe there. That's Abraham's hometown. And of course, Abraham with his household under the leadership of Terah, his father, leave to go up to Haran. Of course, they're following the water source. In Haran, that's where Terah dies. And I think that's the context of where Abraham receives his call. And from Haran, Abraham and his household are going to go down to this area here called the Promised Land. But in this area, ancient Sumeria, there was a renaissance of culture and language and legal code and law and all kinds of a variety of literature that was going on. So you just have to know, we're not talking about somebody just walking around the desert with a burlap bag, and a backpack. We've got developed civilizations, and they're going from place to place, and they're paying taxes, and there's legal people deciding legal decisions, and all of these kinds of things going on. Probably more than you wanted to know. I know you read a little bit on this on your own from the textbook and some other assigned articles, but that's all we need to say about that. Let's move on. I said a few things on this slide here. These are the big 3 areas: ancient Mesopotamia, of course the Promised Land, and down here in Egypt, there's some things that we can say about Egypt, because we've got Abraham visiting Egypt also during some of his travels. And the biblical history with regards to the Egyptian Pharaoh line pretty much lines up with, we've got Moses born, the Pharaoh who sought to kill the Hebrew sons, time of the Exodus in Joshua's conquest of Canaan going on, lining up with this entire line of Egyptian history. A lot of this has to do with um, the fact that the biblical history that's recorded by the author here, namely Moses, he's fully aware of this. His history lines up with Egyptian history as well. He's going to know, and everything, the events, people, places, and things are not taking place in some isolated stage, Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. No, it's live history. It's history that's going on with things that are going on in the world around. So really what we're talking about here is taking the biblical context seriously. And this is interpretation, this is hermeneutics, and you're going to have a class in hermeneutics if you haven't already. We will talk a lot more about this. I just throw out some basic principles for interpretation. We have the Ezra principle in Ezra chapter 7 verse 10, and it says, "For Ezra had set his heart to study the Torah of Yahweh, and to practice it and to teach it, his statutes and ordinances in Israel." So to be an interpreter of the Word of God, to be like Ezra, is to also be willing to set it in his heart. In other words, it's going to have an impact on you as you interpret it. It will interpret you as well, and I'm sure you've heard of that. As we go through the Old Testament, we'll also be taking the structure and genre, the different genres of the Old Testament, seriously. You're going to have law, primarily law/history, Genesis and Deuteronomy. You'll have the history books, which we'll be covering this semester, fall semester, Joshua, all the way to the end, to Esther. And then in the spring, we'll talk about poetry, the Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. And of course, then the prophetic books, the heavy hitters, the major prophets, all the way down to the minor prophets and the lesser-known Italian prophets like Malachi. I'm just kidding. Just a quick word about law and history. We talk about law. The word law oftentimes translates from the Hebrew word that really means instruction. Yara, or the word that's the base word for Torah, with the T on the front, means instruction. So when you talk about Moses writing down law, what we're really talking about is Moses, the author, writing down instruction. And that makes sense given the historical context. I like to talk about the plains of Moab, and I'll be showing you that shortly. Moses, the author, addressing Israel, fledgling nation, preparing them for the promised land. But really we're talking about historiography, both history and theology. So when Moses retells or recounts any of his historical narrative, he's also interjecting and intertwining theological teaching as well. Truth about God, truth about covenant relationship. What does it mean to be properly related to God, and how does that show up in the narratives that we read about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph? Poetry is going to be 50% is in the books that you'd expect, Psalms, Proverbs, and things like that. Those books, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. But we're going to find poetry is a major chunk of the prophets as well. The writing prophets wrote in poetic form, and that's ancient Hebrew biblical parallelism. There's a whole study of that we'll look at in the spring. In the notes, I won't go through it here, but I'm giving you a little exercise that brings a little emphasis on authorial intent. And we're always trying to, when we read the text, is to put on our thinking caps and try to understand what is it that the author is saying. Because the author wrote to be understood. And every book that we read, we're going to be having that as a foundational presupposition. We're reading a text where an author was writing down something that needed to be heard and needed to be and was it was possible, very clear. I'm sorry, what I'm trying to say, to be understood. The author's writing to be understood. And on that idea, we're going to look for the one correct meaning of the text, based on all of our study of the literary context, its canonical context, its historical context. Unless there's intentional ambiguity, sometimes there is, the author leaves us with, the author was intending one true meaning. And so we're not going to ask the typical Sunday school question, what does this passage of Scripture mean to you? As if there were multiple meanings to a single text. No, what we're going to do is say, here's what we, with all of our bells and whistles in operation, here's what we think the text means. And then you can ask the application question. Well, how does it apply to you? You see the difference there? And, they're writing in an ancient context, all the authors, point number 7. Not writing in a vacuum, nor are the authors, just taking down some kind of dictation from some, they're sitting down next to an angel or something. I mean, Moses had his face-to-face with God, but the authors are, they're real people writing, using concepts and ideas that were familiar to the people in whom they're trying to convey information. And we'll look at the difference between prose and poetry here in just a little bit. But the point number 10 is something that we want to make sure that we never leave a study of the text when we're teaching it with our audiences without bringing proper application. And in our class, one of the things I'm trying to do with the voice threads, just put a little plug in for that. A lot of you are doing just great with that. On Friday, get your voice thread done, and that's going to be a more application type exercise, and that's going to be something we'll be doing every week. But the primary focus of our fall semester is just looking at the Old Testament historical narrative. One of the things that, I guess one of the problems that we have in our churches is that we don't help our people understand and train them in how to read the Old Testament narrative, the historical books. So the problem is the Old Testament becomes avoided. When's the last time you heard a sermon out of Chronicles, for example? Or we just go to the Old Testament historical narratives for proof text. We want to go to for example, Genesis 1 to argue against Darwinian evolution. Or we read Gideon in the episode of the fleece as a means of supporting our idea about how to confirm God's will for our life. We just don't know what to do with these historical narratives. Or we over-spiritualize the Old Testament. We think... so there's lots of things, and I'll let you finish looking at this slide on your own. But let's look at the nature of Hebrew historiography and some of the foundational ideas that we need to get in our heads. I mean, two big ideas with regards to historiography and its nature. We're talking about revelation, God revealing himself through historical events, and the inspired interpretation of those same events through the authors of the biblical text. So God himself is active in history with his people. And then you have divinely inspired authors coming along after the events, looking back and bringing and recounting those events into the present moment for their audiences, recounting the people, places, and things, as well as, and more importantly, I would argue, the theology, the truth about God that those narratives reveal. And these authors are, as I said, are writing to be understood. So here's the way forward as we start our trek into the historiography, the historical narratives of the Old Testament. We're going to want to allow the text to say, excuse me, what it wants to say. We're talking about texts that were written primarily for the people of the author's day and context. They were written to make sense. We're going to recognize there's a progress of revelation. Earlier texts would reveal so much about God, but as texts build on each other and continue through the history of salvation, there's going to be more of a revelation. The authors are going to know more about God and know more about what God has in plan for the big picture down the road. We're going to be looking for that one meaning that the author has left, and we recognize that the historical texts are talking about not just history, but also theology, and that's the idea behind historiography. When we talk about Western history, We have chronological precision and accuracy. Hebrew historiography is not that it's messy and not true and not accurate, but it's also going to allow the author to also bring in his theological interpretation and sometimes bias with regards to how he wants to bring and recount that historical event to his audience. So there's something that needs to be, that's what we're going to appreciate about the inspired authors of the Old Testament. In this slide, I've given you a little exercise. I'll let you read that on your own. It's a little example of how we kind of bring everything together with regards to the last chapter and the last verse of what would have been the last book of the Hebrew canon, that is 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And I'll let you look at that and read that. It's just some musings from your professor trying to understand why the author of Chronicles cut the Cyrus decree in half. And it's just, an application and bringing together some of these things that we've been talking about. I'll let you look at that on your own. I'm going to pause the video and break it into two parts. This ends the last little bit of the, you might say, the biblical background discussion. Now we're going to get into the text. Now we're going to talk about Genesis. Now finally we're going to start talking about Genesis 1. So let me break this up and begin a new video for week 3 that is going to begin our discussion of Genesis 1 through 11.